starting a new series with you guys for our deep dive, leading up into the Christmas story, kind of entering into and talking about what the world was like that Jesus was entering into when he was born on Christmas Day. So, with that kind of being said, Josh, what are we going to talk about this first week or this first week, in the series that we're going to start?
So we're going to focus on changes in Judaism, because when you read the Old Testament and you read the New Testament, you see there are a lot of different political structures, religious structures, social structures, and because the focus of Jesus' life and ministry was within this religious context, we're going to start with looking at how Judaism changed from the ending of the Old Testament into what Jesus was living in day to day, what life was like in first century Israel.
Okay. So kind of like starting with the changes after Israel's been exiled.
Yes.
Could you maybe give a little summary or maybe describe to what this exile actually was?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about the Jewish exile. Israel was exiled by Assyria. The northern kingdom of Israel was exiled by Assyria around 730 BC. And Assyria was really the first world empire. Everyone else had sort of localized empires, and even really big, important ones like Egypt sort of stayed in their area. No matter how culturally significant or advanced they were, they didn't spread throughout the known world the way Assyria and some later ones did. And so Assyria was known for being very brutal. They're like, we're going to conquer the world, but to keep the world pacified, we're going to make sure everyone fears us. And it kind of turned out that they didn't so much fear them as they feared and loathed them, just extreme hate. So Babylon took over. And when Babylon was in charge, they conquered Judah. And this was, I want to say 597, they installed a puppet governor type thing, and then there was another Jewish outrising, so they came back in 586 and just leveled the place. We're talking destruction of the temple, we're talking all of these religious artifacts, Ark of the Covenant, all of that. And if you read Lamentations, that's talking about his sorrow at watching Jerusalem destroyed, watching the temple destroyed. So Babylon, their policy was we're going to rule the world, but to be in charge, we are going to make everyone like us. We're going to sort of destroy their cultural identities. We're going to take their idols, take their gods, which for Judah, Babylonians were like, Ark of the Covenant, that must be their idol. I mean, it wasn't, but take their idols, capture their cultural identities, and we are going to take the best of their people, bring them to Babylon, and just try to make everyone Babylonian. But that didn't really work either. And for 70 years, the Jewish people were primarily, there were some that were still in Judah, but there were a lot in exile in Babylon. And so Babylon was eventually cultured because apparently trying to isolate people didn't really work. And the Persians came in, and they were the third big world empire. And their policy was, rather than destroying the cultural identity of everyone we conquer, why don't we let them be themselves, be prosperous, but give us a cut? And this was especially true of Cyrus, the Persian emperor, who gave the Jews not only his blessing, but also financial support to return and rebuild the temple and rebuild Jerusalem. And so that's sort of just I want to say the fast, but I feel like I took too long, rundown of what was going on with the exile. But when the Jews came back from the exile, they had learned a lot about what it took to follow God. They had developed things to sort of help them in that, and they really were committed. That was terrible. Let's never do that again. Let's follow God correctly so that we're not exiled again. So then in 516 BC, they finished rebuilding the Second Temple. So 516 to 70 AD is called the Second Temple period because that's when the building stood.
Okay. So what were some things that has changed during that exile time or during the time of rebuilding that Second Temple?
Yeah. So the first thing is that 70 years is a long time. And it's long enough for you to go as a young man or woman or a person, high school, junior high age, grow up, have kids, your kids to grow up and have kids, and then be like, hey, do you want to go back to that land that you haven't lived in since you were 10, 12, 16, 20, whatever. And so the people who did return returned because they wanted to. They wanted to hold on to their Jewish identity. They wanted to follow God. And so by returning home, maybe they didn't have a lot in Persia, but they were choosing to go to where they knew they didn't have anything pre-built because it was all destroyed. And there were people who had been living there, but they weren't able to rebuild because the local governors or whatever wanted them to just be subservient, and that meant not growing financially, not building walled cities, all this sort of stuff. So the people who returned were very intent on following God. There was a faithfulness that we see in Ezra. The people are ready and eager for in a way that we don't see through almost all of the Old Testament. In Ezra, you read about them hearing the law and weeping. You hear about them hearing about something that they didn't know and being like, we should do that now. And so there's a desire to figure out what it means to follow God that they really came back from the exile with. There's also this reality that there are blessings and consequences, and they really wanted to develop an understanding of what it meant to be obedient to God so that we could prosper as a nation, so we wouldn't be conquered, so we would, whatever selfish or personal or physical reasons behind it, they still saw, hey, when we follow God, things work out better than when we don't and we're exiled. And so there was a desire to develop an understanding of what it took or what it meant to be obedient to God. And maybe one great example of that is the synagogue and what it was used for. So the synagogues, don't hear about them at all in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, they're everywhere. And it's just assumed, because the Old Testament was written by people living at that time to people living at that time, they didn't need an explanation.
Right.
So synagogues popped up probably as a result or a mirroring of what went on in exile. And that was sort of cultural centers for Jews to come together as a community with the purpose of practicing Judaism and celebrating, their religious culture as much as possible outside of the temple. And one of the ways that the synagogue is shown is that they were reading Scripture, reading the Old Testament. It was very important, and it wasn't just you book nerds should know this, but I'm going to be in my field. It was everyone should learn this. And so there was an emphasis on religious teaching, religious understanding that is in contrast to a lot of the attitudes we see in the Old Testament, where as soon as it's not immediately pressed or immediately forced, it sort of goes by the wayside, and then they turn away from God, and then bad things happen and they turn back. Here they're like, okay, we know the bad thing happens because we've been exiled. So let's learn this, and let's keep up with it.
So it kind of sounds like, the end of a happily ever after story, right? Like they've learned from their mistakes, but is that actually what happens? Or
I mean, that doesn't stop them from making new mistakes.
right.
And not necessarily learning the right lessons from their mistakes. So there's kind of a historically quiet period as sort of Persia sort of starts to die off, and then Alexander the Greek, he is Greek, but he's Alexander the Great, comes on the scene, and he conquers the world like these people before him. His strategy to ruling the world was not, you're going to be you, and we're going to be me, and you're going to pay me, like the Persians. It wasn't, you're going to be me because, and you're not going to be you, like the Babylonians. It wasn't, you're going to fear me like the Assyrians. It was, hey, I'm going to come in, and yeah, you're going to pay me some taxes, but I'm going to give you a lot of benefits. I'm going to, start building roads. I'm going to give you my culture instead of taking away yours. And so the term Hellenization is used for like Greek, or it comes from the Greek term for Greece, but it's Greek-like in this sort of cultural or societal sense.
Okay.
And so you have these Jews who are trying to follow God, but now they're in a mixed culture because Alexander has come in and said, here, you also can have my stuff. And, a fair number of Jews appreciate that or follow that or, accept that. And so you have a mix of these like Jews that sort of were following more Greek culture, society, as opposed to stringent Orthodox Judaism. And you have a degree of, well, let's follow pagan gods as well. And this is going to explode after Alexander dies. Because when he dies, his kingdom is split up between three generals. Ptolemy had Egypt, Seleucid had Syria, and someone else had the Europe ones, like Greece and Macedonia, just those minor things. And Ptolemy's didn't really do much, but eventually the Syrian, the Seleucid Empire took over Israel. And when they took over Israel, they saw, hey, there's these religiously fervent Jews who are obstructing the worship of these Greek Jews, and we also want to make sure that they know we're in control now. And so this king, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which you probably will forget, but that's fine, came in and he committed what was called the abomination of desolation, which is where you take the Jewish temple and you turn it into a temple of Zeus and you offer pagan sacrifices. And this did not sit well for Jews, as it wouldn't have.
So the Jews were unified, or would you say they're not unified?
No,
here?
so they're unified against the Seleucids.
Okay.
They're not unified with them themselves. So what
Okay.
happens is the Maccabees are this priest who they're given the name Maccabees. It's not like his actual name, which I think means the hammer, but I didn't look that up. And he leads this sort of guerrilla revolt that just sort of continuously built steam. And you have these people who are trying to restore the proper worship of God, and are willing to die to make it happen. And you have this revolt that eventually overthrows the Seleucids, and there's the Jews are sort of unified in that. And that's actually where we get the story of Hanukkah. That happens within that context. But we'll talk about that more sometime, possibly. Stay tuned. But so you have this priest who rises up, and now you have this now that the Jews are in charge, they're not rallied against a common oppressor, and so all these factions really start to come to light. They existed a bit before, primarily what we read about in the New Testament of the Sadducees. And the Sadducees were sort of like the aristocratic priestly order, and they were very strict on the written law, the written scripture is the only source of truth, which sounds like something we would absolutely agree with. But they went so far as to say, if it's not written in scripture, it's not true, which goes a little bit further than us. Like, I would say that the computer you're watching this on works, right? And I could be wrong, maybe it's a phone, but the concept that is a source of truth that does not equal religious truth. So I guess, but is still something that is possible. And so an example of this is the resurrection and the afterlife. The Old Testament doesn't go into clear detail about what happens when people die. It talks about the importance of how they live, talks about the importance of following God, talks about the importance of being forgiven of sins, but it doesn't give a just crystal clear outline of what happens when we die. And so the Sadducees said, okay, well, it's not written in the Bible, so there cannot be a resurrection from their dead, and there cannot be anything after we die, because it's not written about in Scripture. And this was in contrast to a competing group of people, the Pharisees. So the Sadducees came largely from the priestly order. They were typically wealthy. Because they were a priest, there was like a degree of connection to God in the sense of they could work at the temple. And so there's a degree of almost like a high-class, inclusive group, where the Pharisees were more of a open in the sense of everyone should know this, and your merit is based on how well you are following God, not your position while you are following. And so there was like anyone could like study to become like a Pharisee, and you could agree with the Sadducees, but it was a bit more inclusive, and the Pharisees were more broader throughout the people. And they accepted a more oral tradition on top of Scripture to help with all these understandings. And so an example is they thought the Scriptures about what state of purity, what ritual purity you need to be in to work in the temple should be applied to daily life as well. So, which goes beyond the scope of the Old Testament, as does ideas about what the resurrection of the dead looks like, about ideas about what the afterlife looks like. And so with the Pharisees, what you got was, if we cross this line, we're going to get exiled. But if we're going to, because this is such a this is just like a straight drop off, we're going to create a line here, like a safety barrier, so we don't accidentally destroy ourselves.
Right.
But crossing this line is also very dangerous because we're so close to the edge. So we're going to create a safety line right here to make sure we don't cross this line, to make sure we don't fall off this edge. Well, this is the safety line we're supposed to be following, but because I really care and I'm really righteous, I've set for myself this line. And this is where the super righteous people who really care stand, because they don't even want to cross this line.
Right.
And it just created this culture of just pushing the line back and back to where what it took to live a righteous life was so far beyond what the Old Testament asked for that it was just a huge burden on the people. And so when you read about Jesus talking with the Pharisees, he's saying, hey, you don't care about following God. You care about these sort of systems of lines
Right.
that you've come up with in order to stay what you think righteous is. And so those are sort of two competing theological groups. There's also another one that was relevant called the Essenes, but they were pretty isolationist. They're the people that we have the Dead Sea Scrolls from. So we actually know a fair bit about them, even though they were isolation. But these are sort of three theological groups that came up. And their conflicts weren't strictly theological, because the Sadducees were sort of existed before this, and the Pharisees blamed the Seleucids coming in as God's punishment for the Sadducees' corruption. But the Sadducees were still sort of in charge, and there was this infighting of Sadducees sort of persecuting Pharisees because they're in the rule, Pharisees trying to stand up to it, and then maybe the Pharisees are in charge and now the Sadducees are a bit persecuted. And eventually got to the point that the Sadducees, were in charge, and the Pharisees were like, hey, they are in charge, so we can't stand up against them, but they are perverting the religious rule of the temple. Hey, Rome, can you come in and give us religious autonomy here, but just be the government? Because when the Sadducees were the government and the priests, the Pharisees couldn't really stand up to that. And so Rome came in 63 BC, and that's within a Roman occupation that the Bible took place.
So we've talked a lot about the world that Jesus was stepping into, but we haven't really talked about this expectant Jesus.
Yeah.
So what are the things that we can be waiting for or expecting out of this series of the deep dive? What's this next step then?
Well, the first I'll take a step back and say, what did they think the next step was? Because we haven't really talked. The Messiah wasn't strictly a political figure; there was a religious figure as well.
Right.
And so let's talk about how the Messiah, the idea of it sort of changed between the Old Testament, when it wasn't really that important, and the New Testament, where suddenly everyone's looking for him. And that is, the Messiah was viewed as, they had this history of, we're going to try to follow God, and we screw up and bad things happen, and we try harder, we try differently, and we screw up and bad things happen. We try harder, we try differently, and we screw up and bad things happen. And we are constantly under the thumb of some big international government. And the idea was the Messiah would establish the nation of Israel, and they saw that to do that, they needed to be, at least the religious figures saw that to do that, that they needed to be in a right relationship with God as a country. And the people who didn't really care at least saw, hey, we'll at least be not controlled, not harassed by these other countries. But there was this understanding that to be a prosperous, independent nation meant following God as a nation. And these Sadducees, Pharisees, they got together in. So something we haven't really talked about that I sort of skipped over, but I'll come back to it, is they had this understanding of what is right Judaism. And they thought the Messiah should follow my idea of what right Judaism is, to eventually build a nation that follows God and therefore is independent from outside influence. And so that's sort of what they were looking at for a Messiah. And one thing that I just talked about, I passed over, was the Sanhedrin. When the Maccabees got taken over, there was this idea of, okay, well, we're not in charge of political structure, societal structure, but there's still a religious structure involved. And so that became the Sanhedrin, which is just kind of like a council of elders. And it was 70 people, the high priest and 70 other elders, who governed over sort of Jewish religious or cultural issues that Rome didn't really care about. So a lot of how the temple practice worked, a lot of like little cases involving Jewish law. Rome didn't care. Rome wanted you to pay your taxes and you to not revolt at all, or even talk about it, and that's it. And so the Sanhedrin was this body of elders that we read about in the Gospels and Acts that made these sort of religious decisions for Jewish society, and so it was made up of Sadducees and Pharisees and the high priests, and it was this mixed body, such that at one point, I think it's Peter who brings up the resurrection of the dead when the Sanhedrin is questioning him about what he's doing at the temple. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees turn against each other, start arguing because it was an issue they disagreed on, and there was already so much conflict between them that now the Pharisees were like, hang on, let's hear him out because he's talking about the resurrection of the dead, and you don't like that, and we do. And it just turned into this really contentious thing. And so so that is something you'll read about in relation to the temple and in relation to the organized Jewish religion and culture. But all of it was looking towards a time where they could be prosperous, independent, and they recognized that it appeared like that would only happen when they were perfectly following God and God was making that possible for them. And the Messiah was the person who was supposed to bring that change. Now, Israel had been oppressed before by the Seleucids, and it had freed itself before through the Maccabean revolt. And so they were looking for someone like the Maccabees who were going to be strong and fight it out and assert dominance in the world. They weren't looking for a healer, they were looking for a warrior. They were looking for someone authoritative that the other nations the other emperors would be like, oh, we got to give him his space.
Right.
They weren't looking for someone to come in and say, hey, your soul needs healing.
So that's what we're going to maybe talk about in the coming weeks too a little bit.
We're gonna sort of branch out a little bit into sort of what was going on politically, socially, sort of just outside the Jewish religion, what was the world like he was stepping into. And again, this doesn't give you a full picture. This is just, if you're reading the Old Testament and then you jump immediately to the New Testament, so much has changed.
Right.
And it's not in the scripture because the people lived it out. But we didn't, so let's try to bridge those gaps.
Awesome. So that's something you guys can check back each week on and learning about during this upcoming Christmas season. So.
Yep. Thanks. Bye.